But whenever you're first tempted, that very first temptation, that's a libertarian free act. You could have restrained. You could have refrained from sinning that particular time. And so, like we were
And
saying
backing up,
before,
Adam could
you
have
might
restrained, and he didn't even have the fallen nature.
exactly.
Well,
And Adam's a great
well,
example of someone without a fallen nature who chose to sin, and therefore proving libertarian free will is true.
Yeah, so the statement of faith, and you guys talk about a nature inclined towards sin. So if we're going to talk about basically the state or the condition that we are born into in the line of Adam, I can just read it. We affirm because of the fall of Adam, every person inherits a nature and environment inclined towards sin. And this is a key phrase here. Every person who is capable of moral action will sin. Each person's sin alone brings the wrath of a holy God, broken fellowship with him, ever worsening selfishness, destruction, death, and condemnation, eternity in hell. So obviously you guys have an age of accountability. I'd think, to be fair to your position, if I were to say, what is that number? You would say, well, we don't know. And it's probably different for each person. Would that be right?
I would suppose so. I would
Yeah.
base that upon God's knowledge of a person's understanding. And so, for example, if you had somebody with Down syndrome, obviously that might be a different uh, situation, or somebody with a learning disability or something like that. I think God's fair. I think He's just, and He's going to
Okay.
do what's right.
So can you just
Yeah, it might not be
articulate then what a nature
predetermined.
inclined towards sin? Sorry.
Go ahead, Brian. I'm sorry.
Well, I just was saying it's not a predetermined age necessarily, but yeah, there would be a point when the conscience is mature enough to respond to God's law, and then sin.
Yeah.
Okay, so can you articulate what a nature inclined towards sin means?
Well, I think it means just that. We're inclined to be sinners. That doesn't mean that we are decreed to be sinners or determined to be sinners by God. It means we're inclined that direction. So I could have an inclination to be hot tempered, or somebody could have an inclination to steal things, or an inclination towards same sex attraction. We can have a lot of people with a lot of different inclinations, very different than each other's. But it doesn't mean you're determined to do it. You can go against your inclinations. You can confess your inclinations. Even pagans, unbelievers, can confess their inclination to have a hot temper with their spouse, and ask for forgiveness, and even seek restoration. And so, just because you have an inclination towards something doesn't mean you're forced to do it. And that's, I think, where Calvinists go too far. Is it's more than an inclination on Calvinism. It is a decreed condition by which they cannot do other than what they have been decreed to do, which is every single decision and thought and thing they've ever done has been decreed in eternity past by God, and thus we see no basis for human culpability, responsibility under that way of philosophizing, deterministic philosophy.
Okay, I'm
I
just
would
wondering
I
if we
would
can.
go a step
Sorry, go ahead.
further. I would go a step further than Leighton, and Leighton and I know he knows that we don't agree on everything. But just for the sake of concession, I um, I would say I agree with Leighton that the person is born with the ability to say no to certain sins that he might be tempted to do, but he is not. There is an inability in the sense that it's a downhill slide, and he will eventually sin. God, Romans 11:32, God will commit him to disobedience because of that nature going in that direction. But then God will also have mercy on all. So he will give the opportunity for that same will, which was free to say no for a while, but eventually sinned. That same will be confronted with grace through creation, conscience, gospel, and that same will is still free, even though it's under condemnation. It's not unable to respond to the gracious initiatives that God provides.
So
I have a question about that. Why is it, in your view, why does it necessarily follow that anyone that's born has the inclination to begin with?
Well, for me, I take a view that the soul is passed on from Adam like a acorn, but it's not, from an oak tree. So you get the nature that Adam had, which was changed when he sinned. His nature changed when he sinned, and that nature is passed on in procreation. But the guilt is not passed on, and the nature that Adam received when he sinned was not unable. And you can see that Adam was able to respond to God right after he sinned, and he was able to hear God, and he was able to, understand God. So this idea that the spiritual death that took place at that moment in Adam's life, produced an inability in him and his posterity. I just don't see Scripture holding.
Yeah,
holding that
I
up.
would just add to it. I would just add to what Brian's saying. Just like within Calvinism's ranks, Calvinism is not monolithic. You're going to have different Calvinists who hold to various levels of differing views with regarding the points. Some reject the L altogether. In fact, matter of fact, most of the reformers reject the L back in the day. And so, to your question from earlier, but there's some who would argue maybe that there's not this inherited nature from Adam and these kinds of things, and they would make a stronger case for a weaker view of the nature of man, nature of sin. But I always try to bring people back and say, okay, even if we, I like to concede as much as possible in a discussion, because when you concede something, you can say, okay, I may not agree with that, but let's just say it's true. It still doesn't prove your case, because proving that someone has an inclination or a nature to sin doesn't prove they can't confess that in light of the gospel, calling them to reconciliation from that very nature, from that fall. And so that's what I always try to point Calvinists to, that some of those, especially traditional Southern Baptists, are very much in line with a lot of what Calvinists say with regard to the nature of sin and the inherited guilt. I know some provisionists that hold to inherited guilt. I held to inherited guilt for the first 3 or 4 years of my broadcast, because I hadn't really questioned it, never did really question it until later. And so you don't have to give up that concept of inherited guilt even to be a provisionist. I have, because I've been convinced that that's not what the Bible teaches. But at the same time, even if we were to concede there's an inherited guilt and nature of sin and all those kinds of things, it still doesn't prove the inability concept of the T, which is the idea that we can't respond positively even to God's gracious appeals to be reconciled from that fall. And so that's our major point of contention. And I think it has to really drill in on that versus some of the more superfluous matters.
Okay, a follow-up question. In your view, it necessarily follows that someone with this as an inclination to sin will most definitely sin. Is that correct? Is that a fair representation of your view?
Yeah, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There might be some
and
philosophical
Romans
differences.
11:32. Yeah.
Go ahead, Brian.
So you said Romans 11:32.
Except for those that die before the age of moral ability.
I actually want to come back to that, but I do want to. But you also hold to libertarian free will, and can you define that for everyone so we make sure? I like to define the term so we make sure we're talking about the same thing.
It's often referred to as a contra-causal ability to do otherwise. There's also, some of the philosophers have added in that there might be a situation in which something can be, referred to as, not necessarily the contra-causal ability to do otherwise, and more of a source libertarianism, meaning the source of your choice is from you, not from something external to you. And so that definition, I think, gets better to the heart of things, because I'm not making a decision because God decreed for me to make a decision. My choice is mine, and therefore I am the first cause of my moral decisions. And so that kind of gets to the philosophical side of it. Now, is there mystery associated with that? Of course. Obviously, there's mystery associated with God's first cause choices. I mean, when did God choose to save you or not save you? Could he have not saved you instead of saving you? Could he have not created instead of creating. There's mysteries involved with that. And I think there's some level of mystery with regard to how we make our choices. But I think it's ours and not God's when it comes to what we're held morally accountable for.
So
if I may add to
go
if I
ahead.
may add to Leighton's definition, if you don't mind, and to bring scripture into this, because I think anything that's going to be profitable in our discussion tonight should be tied to scripture somehow. Um, I like the definition that I kind of see in First Corinthians chapter 7, verse 37, and that is it's not related to salvation, but let me just read it here. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart to do the decision of that context. I like the wording there that he has power over his own will. He's making a determination in his own heart, and that idea of no necessity. There's no precondition that's forcing him to make this decision.
But you just said
So
we
I-
have a nature inclined towards sin that will surely sin. So how does that square with
Okay,
what you
so,
just
so
said?
let me address that. So having a free will that can make free will decisions does not mean that a superior being like God, the Creator, can't step in and limit the use of that will so that it doesn't have the freedom at certain times or moments, doesn't have the possibilities or options or possibilities available to it. So you have a free will that's not free, in a sense, to do a certain thing, but is still free to do other certain things that are possible.
So
I don't know if that helps at all. So it's not
a little
libertarian
bit,
free
but
will to do anything.
so God is creating us in a condition whereby we will certainly sin one day, correct?
Yes. Mhm.
So if it's a sure
Freely.
thing, oh yeah, freely, just like we would say everybody's
Not
acting freely.
compatibilistically
Like when you
freely,
read that
but
verse,
libertarianly
nobody's going
freely.
to disagree. Right, nobody's going to disagree with the verse you read because we act on our desires and we're freely doing stuff. But if God is creating us in a condition whereby we will certainly sin, again, I'm trying to ask this from a general standpoint. I know we're Calvinists, but we're trying to keep it not about that. Why am I responsible for my first sure sin if it's inevitable?
Because
In other
you could have
words,
done otherwise. You could have done otherwise. And this is
And
the
you did it
analogy I used
freely.
before. Yeah,
in
you
what
did it freely.
sense?
You did it. You not compatibilistically freely, but libertarianly freely. You could have done otherwise. The
In what
source of
sense
it
could
was
I have done
you.
otherwise?
The source of it was you,
But you
not
just
God's
said I'm
decree.
surely going to sin.
Yeah, but
I
not
said
a
eventually you
specific
will surely sin,
predestined
but not a
sin.
specifically time. Yeah, that God had destined before you to do. So I've used this analogy, and maybe even you, Colin, made fun of me for it. Somebody made fun of me for it, and because they think I'm trying to equate kicking a field goal with sin, and that's not what I'm doing. I'm giving an analogy. Okay, the analogy is: could a field goal kicker make any given field goal? Yes, he lines up. He can make any given field goal, but would it be unreasonable to say that it's not feasible? That's a word that William Lane Craig likes to use. It's not feasible to suggest that the kicker will always make the field goal, because they
Why
always
not?
will fail eventually. And so too,
Well,
we're not saying any particular sin is predestined by God for it to happen. You're going to fail because you're fallible. You're able to fall, mutable. You're able to fall, so you will fall. But whenever you're first tempted, that very first temptation, that's a libertarian free act. You could have restrained. You could have refrained from sinning that particular time. And so, like we were
And
saying
backing up,
before,
Adam could
you
have
might
restrained, and he didn't even have the fallen nature.
exactly.
well,
And Adam's a great
well,
example of someone without a fallen nature who chose to sin, and therefore proving libertarian free will is true.